I'm 32-year-old Eliza Bennett, attending our yearly family gathering in my grandmother's house, wearing expensive watches and brand labels and feeling alienated among family members. Condescending murmurs and sidelong stares are evoked by my plain jacket and understated jewelry. Even if they have the same ancestry, they made fun of my financial difficulties for 10 years. As I established my kingdom in silence, they have no idea what I have in my briefcase today. I want to know where you're viewing from before I go on with my narrative. In the comments, include your location. Click the subscribe button and stay tuned to learn how I eventually demonstrated true riches to my status-obsessed family. Since my great-grandfather transformed a modest inheritance into a burgeoning empire during the post-war boom in the 1920s, my family, the Bennetts, has been a mainstay of Boston real estate. The Bennett name was well known for upscale real estate in New England by the 1970s, when my grandmother Elizabeth took control. Grandma Elizabeth was a clever businesswoman who felt that money should be quiet and useful in contrast to her brothers, who prioritized status and flair. Her practical approach was passed down to my father, her youngest son. The status-conscious Bennett was rather scandalized when he fell in love with my mother, a kindergarten teacher who had no family money. They decided to live simply in a tiny suburb. To the dismay of the family, Dad was an architect, and instead of creating status symbols, he designed homes that people would truly love to live in. They taught me that money was a tool, not a character attribute, although my mother was still teaching. My world fell apart in an instant when they perished in a vehicle accident while returning home from a weekend getaway when I was 15 to Sayin. While my aunts and uncles murmured that I had turned into the family's charity case, Grandma Elizabeth welcomed me in. Grandma would frequently be in her study late at night during those first agonizing months, going through old photo albums or examining real estate portfolios. According to Eliza, the majority of the family has lost the true purpose of prosperity. They believe it's for show, but true riches is not evident. It's potential security and ability to bring about change. She taught me more about investing money and property assessment in the 3 years I lived with her before to attending college than any school could. She taught me how to spot inexpensive homes, interpret market patterns, and above all, be patient. Brad Victoria Taylor. Jessica and Blake, my cousins, all had somewhat different upbringings. After Grandpa passed away, Uncle Richard assumed the role of patriarch of the family, supported ostentatious consumerism. His kids, along with the kids of my other aunts and uncles, wore only brand clothing, went on lavish trips every school break, and got sports vehicles for their 16th birthdays. I worked part-time jobs, invested every spare cash, and drove the Toyota my parents had left me. Grandma Elizabeth died while I was a senior in college, leaving each grandchild with a small legacy, while my cousins used theirs to pay for extravagant condominiums, far-flung trips, or even more absurd things. Blake purchased a little yacht that he seldom ever uses. I did as my granny said. I continued to work, lived modestly in a modest apartment, and wisely used my inheritance to buy underappreciated little homes in developing communities. Grandma Elizabeth started the yearly family meeting as a means of maintaining harmony and a common goal among the family. Uncle Richard turned it into a fight for prestige when she passed away. Who updated their portfolio the most impressively? Who has accumulated the priciest items? Which cousin's career trajectory was the most impressive? Each year I would arrive dressed modestly, give them my purposefully subtle updates, and put up with their barely veiled sympathy. None of them were aware that by the time I was 28, I had acquired 3 small commercial buildings and 12 residential homes through anonymous LLCs, expanding my portfolio. Under the direction of Mr. Winter's grandma's former attorney, I found out last year that the large apartment building where my cousin Blake, Uncle Richard's daughter Victoria, and 3 other relatives resided was up for sale. The owner was hoping for a quiet sale, utilizing a holding company structure because he was retiring and didn't want to worry the renters. I bought the building for $28 million, almost all of my available funds, with the assistance of Mr. Winters. I made minor adjustments while maintaining total anonymity about my ownership, including a little but far below market rent increase. As I was getting ready for this year's conference, I learned that Uncle Richard would suggest selling Grandma's house, which is the center of our family's history, and the final tangible link to her knowledge. I'm standing in the same home now, watching my family show off their wealth, utterly oblivious to the fact that the impoverished relative they've long ridiculed owns the house where many of them live. On Friday afternoon, I arrived at Grandma's estate in my 10-year-old Toyota, which I had been driving since college. Luxury cars were already shining in the circular driveway. Brad's brand new Maserati was parked next to the front steps. Uncle Richard's Bentley, Aunt Catherine's Mercedes SUV, and other expensive vehicles that most likely cost more than most people's homes. I parked my Toyota, which appeared to have inadvertently wandered into the wrong neighborhood between Victoria's BMW and Blake's Range Rover. I inhaled deeply, brushed down my basic Banana Republic blue jacket, and looked in the rearview mirror at my little applied makeup. With its 3 stories of graceful Georgian brick architecture, white columns at each side of the entryway, and well-tended grounds spanning 4 acres, the home appeared much as it had always done. As I ascended the limestone steps, I had a well-known mixture of anxiety and warmth. After my parents passed away, this home served as a haven for me, but now it symbolized the growing distance between my decisions and those of my family. I had deliberately arrived early in order to enjoy some quiet moments before the whole family circus arrived. Before I could even ring the bell, Martha, the housekeeper, who had worked for our family for more than 30 years, opened the door. Miss Eliza smiled and drew me into a cozy embrace that had a scent of cinnamon varnish and lemon furniture. "It's very good to see you. Every year you resemble your granny more." For the first time that day, I truly smiled. "Regards, Martha. You continue to be this place's greatest welcome committee." Insidiously, she dropped her voice. "I wanted to let you know that Mr. Richard has been here since the morning consulting with the family lawyer and changing the conference schedule. Although it wasn't shocking this supported my assumptions regarding the selling of the property. I was assisted by Martha in moving my weekend luggage to my former room, the one where I had spent those early years with my grandmother. This guest room was virtually unaltered in contrast to the others that had undergone several redecorations. Grandma had adored the same white furnishings, window seat, and pastel blue walls that overlooked the rose garden. I touched the bookcase, which still included my old favorite financial textbooks, and mixed them with novels. The little framed picture of my parents and me at Cape Cod the summer before they passed away, and the notebook in which my grandmother had taught me how to chart stock movements. A knock on the door interrupted my unloading. The one relative who had ever consistently been friendly to me, my cousin Jessica, was standing there. "I believed I heard you come." Leaning against the doorframe, she grinned. Although she maintained the required degree of family affluence, Jessica had established her own career as a pediatrician, in contrast to our other cousins. She was dressed in a cashmere sweater and fancy pants that likely cost more than my whole ensemble, but there was none of the condemnation I typically saw in her gaze. "I wanted to let you know in advance of everyone arriving. This weekend, Uncle Richard has a lot planned. He will suggest that the mansion be sold." My gut dropped when I heard this confirmation, even though I had suspected it. But this location is part of our history. That is not what Grandma would have wanted. With a sigh, Jessica moved to sit next to me on the bed. "I understand, but he's discussing updating family assets and releasing the value of real estate. The majority of the votes are already in his favor." Votes. Uncle Richard also created the Bennett family's system of government. Following the death of Grandma, one's contribution to the total family holdings was used to weight family decisions. In other words, Richard, the most commercially successful, successfully influenced the majority of choices. I had very little voting power because of my little disclosed assets. "Is it the reason for our 3-day gathering rather than the customary 2?" I inquired. Jessica gave a nod. "Saturday's property talk, Sunday's financial review, and Monday's crucial vote. Where the palace would go, he is bringing in developers to show ideas for opulent condos." My heart fell. It was more than just a structure. It was the final tangible reminder of Grandma's morals and wisdom. It was almost sacrilegious to consider its demolition for more upscale real estate. "This is going to be fought." Silently, I said. My hand was gripped by Jessica. "I understand, and I'll support you. However, be ready for opposition." She looked at her timepiece. In 20 minutes, everyone is getting together for supper. Victoria has already inquired twice about the arrival of the unfortunate relative. I made an effort to grin. I wouldn't want to let her down. Following Jessica's departure, I paused to gather my thoughts. The stakes were much greater now, even though I had a strategy going into this conference. That night's dinner was just what was expected. Fine china crystal glasses, and talk aimed for showcasing everyone's most recent accomplishments. Grandma used to sit at the head of the table where Uncle Richard presided. He boasted while swirling his 30-year-old scotch about his most recent development project, which sold out before construction was even completed. Catherine said that her charity dinner had earned $100,000 more than the previous years, but pointedly pointed out that she hadn't seen Eliza's name on any lists of generous donors recently. We had to reject away purchases. Due to nepotism, my cousin Brad, who is now an executive at Uncle Richard's firm, constantly bringing up his new Maserati. They expedited for our family name, even though the waiting list was 9 months long. He looked at me and grinned. "Eliza, what do you drive these days? That Toyota still?" The water was still completely okay when I took a drink. Patricia. Uncle Richard's wife clicked sympathetically. "You know, sweetheart, you could afford to improve your standard of living a little if you only allowed Richard to guide you in real estate investing." I suppressed the desire to tell her that without Richard's guidance, my real estate ventures were doing well. I just grinned instead. I'm at ease with my decisions. Throughout dinner, I kept hearing subtle jabs about exclusive clubs that I wasn't a part of, references to vacation houses that I didn't own, conversations about cousins' kids attending private schools that I couldn't afford if I had children. In spite of everything, I remained hopeful that there would be a way to establish a true familial bond once they realized the whole situation. Grandma's rose garden, which is now softly lit by landscape lighting, was the first place I visited on my own after supper. There she stood, surrounded by her meticulously grown flowers. I made the decision once more to protect her legacy, the actual home, as well as the principles she had taught me. Even if it meant ultimately exposing what I'd been hiding for all these years, I would find a way to pay tribute to her memory this weekend. Golden fall sunlight filtered through the curtains of my childhood bedroom on Saturday morning. I wore a basic blue blouse and black pants as part of my thoughtful outfit, professional without being ostentatious. In the grand drawing room where generations of Bennetts had made choices that built our family's wealth, the main family discussion would start at lights 9. I could feel the mood change as soon as I walked into the room. Architectural drawings of contemporary condominiums have taken the place of the customary family photos on the walls. My cousins and their husbands occupied the antique chairs set in a semicircle, and Uncle Richard stood at the front next to a digital projector. There were a few individuals in the back row that I didn't recognize. The developers Jessica had mentioned, I suppose. Uncle Richard said, "Good of you to join us, Eliza," as I slipped into a seat next to Jessica. Doi. Our conversation on family norms and image was just getting started. As I sat down, I noticed how numerous cousins looked at each other and nodded courteously. Clicking through slides that displayed the Bennett family holdings emblem splashed on ever more opulent structures, Richard began his presentation. He paced in his Italian leather shoes, which likely cost more than my rent each month, and said that image is currency in our world. Only if we uphold certain values and how we conduct ourselves in public do the Bennett name open opportunities. He looked at me thoughtfully for a time, then went on. After talking about a number of ongoing development initiatives, he moved on to the family residence reassessment slide. When a stunning shot of Grandma's home came up on the screen, my heart fell. This land has been in our family for 4 generations, as you are all aware. Even while it has sentimental significance, it now stands on 5 acres of great real estate worth about $45 million. Aunt Victoria held up her manicured hand, looking dapper in her fancy suit, and her hair well highlighted. Before you go any further, Richard, I believe we should admit that certain members of the family may have strong emotional ties to the old house. With a smile that stopped short of her eyes, she turned to face me. Everyone respect that you lived here for a while, Eliza, my darling. However, you are undoubtedly aware that emotion cannot impede prudent financial judgment. Blake, my cousin, interrupted me before I could reply. Speaking of wise financial choices, is anybody outside looking at my new SL Roadster? I only got it yesterday. Limited quantity. In North America, just 20. The obvious purpose of the not-so-subtle topic shift was to draw attention to the disparity between their and my financial circumstances. Very good. Richard gave a nod of approval. That is precisely the type of statement piece that strengthens the standing of our family in the neighborhood. He then went on to describe a strategy for selling the mansion in his presentation. Naturally, distribute the profits among family owners according to their present interests and build opulent condominiums on the site. The developers in the back row started handing us glossy pamphlets with drawings of steel and glass buildings that had little in common with the cozy brick house that had housed our family for centuries. Richard said proudly that the anticipated return on investment is large. Before we go to the preliminary vote, are there any questions? I held up my hand, and Richard gave me a barely disguised look of irritation. I believe we ought to take Grandma Elizabeth's desires into account. Despite my heart pounding, I spoke steadily. She particularly wanted this house to be kept as a historical landmark and a location for our family to get together. On several occasions, she reminded me that not everything should be evaluated based on its possible return on investment. Elizabeth had many good traits, but Uncle Richard's smile narrowed. Since her time, the market has seen significant shift. Aunt Catherine tittered, what made sense back then doesn't always make sense now. Apart from Eliza, you might not have much influence in this region, given your inexperience and expensive real estate. I kept going. I've looked at neighborhood patterns and home values. Instead of being destroyed for yet another opulent construction that could remain partially unoccupied like the Westbrook project did last year, this location's historic significance actually raises its value as a conserved property. After a period of silence, Brad laughed dismissively and briefly. Analysis. What real estate knowledge would you have? Even a home of your own is out of your price range. I take it you're still renting that little flat downtown? A few of my relatives laughed, and my cheeks began to flush. I responded that my housing decisions are intentional rather than constrained. Brad, however, spoke over me. Indeed, they are similar to my conscious decision to drive a $150,000 vehicle rather than a 10-year-old Toyota. Cousins, some of us can afford our options. Others just act as though their constraints are their own decision. Richard cleared his throat. Not to defend me, but to further the conversation. The idea of selling and redeveloping should be put to a preliminary vote. After lunch, we may discuss concrete suggestions. Only Jessica and I opposed selling, and the vote was heavily in favor of it, just as Jessica had prophesied. When we took a lunch break, a crushing weight of disappointment weighed on me. Losing the house wasn't the only issue. It was the knowledge that I was viewed by my family as only a poor relation, someone who didn't impress them with her money account, hence her viewpoint was worthless. During lunch, Jessica saw me sitting on the stone bench in the garden, where my grandmother used to regale me with tales of our family's past. She sat next to me and apologized. Such snobs they can be. I fought back tears as I nodded. Even the money isn't the point. They've never bothered to inquire as to what I do for a living or the reasons behind my decisions. They simply think that I'm having trouble keeping up. My hand was gripped by Jessica. In any case, I've always respected the way you've blazed your own trail. It's nice that you don't have to constantly flaunt yourself. I grinned appreciatively, but the altercation in the morning had hurt me more than I had anticipated. I had convinced myself for years that my family's view was irrelevant, that whether they liked it or not, I was doing something worthwhile. However, I was still harmed in unexpected ways by their casual brutality and rejection. Jessica's voice trailed off as we made our way back to the home. The session tomorrow will be worse, just so you know. Each participant is required to provide their year's financial highlights. Richard always arranges it to highlight the person who is most important to the family's reputation. Already dreading it, I nodded. I appreciate the caution. The topic of discussion at dinner that night was which upscale features ought to be part of the new condominium complex that will take the place of our family home. I became aware of how drastically different our beliefs had become as I listened to them argue about whether to have private rooftop gardens or infinity pools, or whether to use marble or foreign limestone finishes. As I sat quietly, I thought about how my family and I were becoming more and more separated, I couldn't help but question if I still wanted a bridge to span it, or if one would ever be built. The topic of the Sunday morning session was property holdings and inheritance issues, our annual family conference's main course. Overnight, the informal sitting arrangement in the drawing room was replaced with a large mahogany table. With leather portfolios positioned at each setting, Uncle Richard assumed his seat at the head. I couldn't help but notice how much slimmer mine was than everyone else's. Richard said, "After everyone has been seated, we will review our individual and collective holdings today. Our family's voting system is weighted by contributions to total assets, as you are aware. I've taken the time to create a revised evaluation." He gave his assistant a nod, and the assistant handed out spreadsheets that listed all of the family members' stated assets, along with the voting power that went with them. Richard himself received 38% of the vote, as was to be expected, with the majority of the remaining votes going to his brothers and children. Only my low earnings as a financial advisor and the minor bequest from my grandmother, which I had officially disclosed, were included in my voting share, which was indicated at a meager 2%. My work title is purposefully ambiguous, Richard went on. I'd like to suggest some changes to the distribution framework set up in Elizabeth's before we start individual presentations. Okay, I was immediately drawn to this. Some safeguards had been incorporated into Grandma's will to keep any one family member from becoming overly dominant. For administrative efficiency, Richard was now proposing to simplify these safeguards. As family members nodded in agreement, the suggested reforms would essentially centralize greater power with the richest family members, especially him. I took note of every proposed change. Mr. Winters and I would need to talk about these important topics later. Following the conversation on inheritance, we discussed personal financial updates. Brad was the first to speak, boasting about his new role as vice president in Uncle Richard's business, his luxury investment portfolio, and the bonuses he had earned. He finished smugly that last month he had closed on the new holiday house in Aspen, which had 4 bedrooms, access to both ski-in and ski-out, and a hot tub with a view of the mountains. Blake followed, bragging about his investments in tech startups and the boat he had refurbished, because the previous one was simply too small for appropriate entertaining. Victoria talked about the exclusive school where she had gotten spaces for her kids and her growing art collection. Naturally, they made an exception for the Bennett name, despite the 5-year waiting list. My family listed their growing money and prestige markers one by one. Appreciative nods and follow-up inquiries were given to each presentation. Aunt Catherine instantly provided connections for the top domestic assistance service when Taylor indicated that she was having trouble finding domestic help for her 3 residences. Only specific families are served by them. But I'll add a word. Eventually, the topic of discussion shifted to the upscale apartment building where a number of family members resided. It was the exact building I owned in secret. "The facilities are excellent," Victoria said. "However, there have been certain adjustments made by the management that I don't really like. Construction noise has been disturbing everyone while they renovate the lobby. They increased the rent last quarter," and Blake gave a forceful nod. "Not in a big way, but theoretically. They believe they are," who Brad narrowed his eyes and leaned forward. "Do you know what's odd? The true owner of the structure is now unknown. Some holding firm bought it last year. Really enigmatic." Uncle Richard gave his pen a contemplative tap on his portfolio. "Maybe we should use some familial ties to figure out who made the transaction. We might be able to convince them to sell to us instead if it's an investment organization. Those of you who live there would profit from having control over the great site." My pulse pounded at how nonchalantly they talked about utilizing their power to exert pressure on the unidentified owner, but I kept a straight face. I was forced to sell against my will. Richard went on. "We could exert some pressure through the appropriate channels." The casual way they talked about leveraging their connections to basically coerce a property owner infuriated me, since I knew individuals at the city planning office who may approve their future modifications. Grandma had always disapproved of entitled conduct like this. Use family authority to extract value from others rather than to add to it. Late in the afternoon, when it was finally my turn, I gave a very modest overview of my consulting job and moderate rise in investments. While I was speaking, I saw Uncle Richard tapping his pen anxiously, Victoria conversing to her husband, and Brad checking his phone. Nobody shown interest in my meticulous financial plan or offered follow-up inquiries. Rather, Aunt Catherine notices the initial hesitation to inquire. "Have you thought about changing careers, dear? With the Bennett name behind you, surely you could pursue something more substantial." There was no mistaking the contempt in her voice. Brad smirked and interrupted before I could reply. "Perhaps she simply must get married. That's still a good tactic, isn't it?" Poorly disguised laughing flooded the room. Even though my cheeks were burning, I maintained a calm face. I said calmly, "I'm pretty happy with my current path." Success is measured differently by different people. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. "Speaking of various metrics, I believe we want to talk about a particular clause for family members who could require more assistance." Everyone understood who he was referring to, even though he didn't look at me. The Bennetts have always looked out for one another, and maybe we ought to create a formal framework for others who haven't had as much luck in their financial pursuits. Being referred to as a charity case was an almost intolerable shame. As they discussed ways to assist me without really asking me what I may need or desire, I sat stiffly in my chair with my fists gripped firmly beneath the table. I fled to my room later that night and contacted my trusty counsel and lawyer, Mr. Winters. "Grandma's will provisions are going to be altered," I stated, outlining the suggested changes. Additionally, they are discussing looking into who owns Victoria's building. Mr. Winters gave a quiet laugh. "This is what I expected. Do not be concerned. Your ownership structure is anonymous and totally safe. Your identity is protected by several business levels." I let out a sigh as I gazed out the window at the moonlit garden. Keeping my investments a secret is no longer the only goal. Grandma's house is going to be sold. The core of her legacy and their discussion of leveraging familial ties to persuade others to break the law to their advantage. She hated everything about it. Mr. Winters added softly, "You've honored Elizabeth's true values, and she would be proud. Now what would you like to do?" As I saw a cloud cross the moon, I pondered for a while. "I believe it's time to have my whole portfolio paperwork ready. Could you please send the full ownership information for the apartment complex and all other properties?" "Are you certain?" With caution, he inquired. "There is no turning back once your holdings are made public." "Sure," I answered. The hurt I had previously experienced was replaced by a renewed sense of resolve. This is the last time they have undervalued me. I'll show them exactly who they've been ignoring for years tomorrow. As I got ready for the last day of our family conference, Monday morning came with a sense of dread. Each member of the family would give their investment plans and comprehensive financial statements today. The part of our yearly reunion that had always been intended to draw attention to the disparity between my ostensibly low income and my family excessive riches. I chose a straightforward yet sophisticated black dress that I had bought on sale at Nordstrom last year, dressing more thoughtfully than usual. By the time I got there, the family had gathered in the library, paired with my mother's pearl earrings, which were the only jewelry I ever wore to these occasions. The Bennett family crest is embossed on the antique table, which is now covered in laptops, iPads, and pricey leather portfolios. Uncle Richard started out by stressing the value of upholding family norms and included a comparison chart that displayed the net worth rise of each family member over the previous 5 years to our customary rituals. His own impressive accomplishment was shown in navy blue on the bar graph he projected onto the projector screen, followed by large columns for his brothers and kids. On the chart, my contribution was a little sliver at the very end. Some of us have embraced the Bennett tradition of financial savvy more successfully than others. He continued smiling thinly at me. A few of the family members laughed, and I saw Brad nudge Victoria as they both gave me a badly disguised look of enjoyment. Uncle Richard himself kicked off the individual presentations by outlining his growing commercial real estate enterprise, intentions to build a chain of upscale hotels, as well as recent purchases in emerging markets. My relatives came next with equally striking performances. Blake's tech investments that seemed to have doubled in value Victoria's husband's hedge fund success, and Brad's CEO remuneration package. Every presentation was met with insightful queries, grateful mutterings, and recommendations for further chances for development. The enthusiasm in the room clearly diminished when it was my time. Some family members grabbed their phones while others struck up hushed side chats. Following the script I had been following for years, I started my prepared overview of minor investments and consulting contracts. Uncle Richard made it obvious that he didn't think this was a formality deserving his whole attention by constantly checking his watch. With a deep sigh, Aunt Catherine cut me off midway through my presentation. "I don't intend to be cruel, but it hurts to see you consistently living so much below your potential, Eliza. There should be some value in the Bennett name. However, you appear committed to well struggle." As everyone's attention shifted to me, the room became quiet. I maintained a neutral expression. "My life wouldn't be described as difficult, Aunt Catherine. I feel really at ease with my decisions." Brad snorted. "Cozy in your small apartment with your 10-year-old automobile and used furnishings. Let's be truthful. The poor relation is you. We are all aware of it." The room echoed with more laughing. "Some of us are less constrained today." Brad kept getting more interested in his subject, which is truly carrying on the family tradition. On the minimum, others are simply coasting. Grandma abandoned them. The nonchalant brutality was more devastating than I had anticipated. Even after years of their contempt, it still hurt to be publicly ridiculed. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. "To advance the situation, not to protect me. Maybe this would be a good time to talk about the family aid program that I brought up yesterday. It's okay to ask for help when you need it, Eliza. To assist you in maintaining a more suitable lifestyle for someone with our family, we may set up a monthly stipend." Name. The last straw was when they implied that I required their charity, even though I was worth more than a number of them put together. But I didn't lose my cool. Years of experience, concealing my actual emotions, working fine for me. "You won't have to do that, Uncle Richard. However, I appreciate your concern." As I gathered my notes, I said evenly, "Before lunch, if my presentation is over, I'll go outside for a breath." My hands shaking with anger and pain. I hurried upstairs to my room as soon as the library door closed behind me. I eventually let the tears flow when I was alone myself. It was the agonizing realization that my family had never really seen me, not the lack of money. Without ever attempting to see past their presumptions, they had constructed a story about who I was. Grandma and I used to sit together in the window seat overlooking the garden that she had always cherished. Now what would you do? In the silence of the room, surrounded by recollections of the one relative who had genuinely appreciated me, I muttered, as though she may somehow respond. The wounded heart inside me was replaced by a hardened determination. I had respected this home, this tradition, in ways they couldn't even fathom, and it was as much mine as theirs. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. The housekeeper Martha came in looking worried. "I brought you some tea, Miss Eliza." "You left the meeting quite soon," I noted. Her thoughtful gesture made me cry again. Unlike my relatives Martha, who had been with the family for decades, had always shown me true kindness. They still think of me as that adolescent orphan in need of help. I smiled appreciatively as I accepted the teacup. I will always remain their poor relative, regardless of what I do. Martha sat next to me, her apron being smoothed by her old hands, a motion I recognized from when she was a youngster, and gathered her thoughts. "Your grandma used to remark softly that some people's vision is severely impaired by their money. They are unable to recognize what is truly valuable. They can only see what is most visible to them." After pausing, she continued, "The way you have respected Miss Elizabeth's lessons would make her very proud. You were the only one who truly knew what the Bennett legacy should imply," she would constantly say. It was unexpectedly comforting to hear this affirmation from someone who had known my grandma well. "Thank you. Martha, you don't realize how much that means." After giving me a hand pat, she got up. "While you were in the meeting, the item you had been anticipating came. On your desk, I placed it." My heart jumped. I had received the needed paperwork from Mr. Winters. "Thank you." I repeated myself with new intent. I spread the contents of the delivery package on my bed after Martha departed. Corporate ownership structures, property titles, portfolio appraisals, and above all the records attesting to my ownership of the upscale apartment building where Victoria Blake and 3 other family members presently reside. I felt a weird mix of melancholy and vindication, as I ran my finger over the title document with its official seal. I intended to disclose my actual financial situation tomorrow. But after being humiliated today, I started to wonder if I still wanted these individuals in my life. Did I truly need the approval of relatives who had only been casually nasty and condescending to me? I had flashbacks as I collected the papers. At this same desk, Grandma taught me how to read financial documents and explained that real riches was about generating opportunity and stability, rather than showing off status. In the past, the Bennett name meant more than just bragging, she once told me. It required honesty vision and responsible use of privilege. I made my choice then based on the proof of how rigorously I had followed her advice. I had no intention of telling them about my accomplishment in order to gain their respect or approval. I would do it to pay tribute to Grandma's real legacy and to prove to everyone that I wasn't just a minor character in the Bennett family's history. Its future was me, whether or not they were aware of it. Uncle Richard's decision to change the topic of conversation to tenant relations and the upscale apartment complex where Victoria Blake and many other family members lived gave the afternoon session a new lease on life. As I sat there, papers safely tucked away in my portfolio, listening to my family gripe about property management choices that I had personally authorized, I couldn't help but notice the irony. Victoria claimed that the installation of the new security system had been extremely disruptive, tossing her gorgeously highlighted hair in the process. At 9 in the morning, the contractors get to work. 9. It's as though anybody should have to listen to construction sounds while eating breakfast. Blake gave a forceful nod. Additionally, a new visitor registration procedure has been put into effect. There's no need for it at all. In fact, I had to list my housekeeper as a frequent visitor. Are they unaware of who we are? Stippling his fingers in the commanding manner he had taken following Grandma's death. Richard leaned forward. Family control over important properties is crucial for this reason. Prestigious tenants' requirements are not understood by new management when buildings shift hands. Knowing that the security measures had been put in place, I kept my mouth shut while they went on. Multiple complaints from other neighbors of unidentifiable individuals entering amenity areas followed a break-in that occurred 2 levels below Victoria's unit and the guest policy. In fact, during the previous year, my upgrades had raised the building's worth by 12%. Naturally, they only noticed the slight annoyances. Jenkins has examined the ownership arrangement for me. Referring to his own lawyer, Richard went on. Horizon Holdings, which is owned by Summit Investments and seems to be managed by an offshore corporation that is purposefully obfuscated, bought the building last year, raising the possibility that they may be susceptible to the appropriate type of pressure. The methodical manner in which he talked about using familial ties to basically intimidate the owner, something snapped within of me. Nevertheless, I kept up my composed appearance, which had served me well over the years. How much pressure, I asked naively. Richard grinned, oblivious to the perilous tone in my words. Approval procedures can always be accelerated or postponed based on connections with the appropriate authorities. Additionally, we represent a sizable chunk of their luxury units since we have 5 Bennett family members as renters. A concerted effort may make them uneasy about continuing to be the proprietors. Brad laughed. In addition, our pals at the city assessor's office could suddenly become extremely interested in examining their properties if we discover tax discrepancies or code infractions. As my family casually discussed leveraging their power to basically badger a property owner into selling against their will, I watched in astonishment. As Eliza Breyer turned to face me, she smirked and continued, a textbook example of the entitled behavior Grandma had always criticized. In the real world, real estate operates in this manner. You can't even afford your own house, so it's not like you'd understand. I take it you're still renting that small flat downtown? After a brief period of silence, the audience erupted in awkward laughing. I was enraged by more than simply the ridicule. It was their embracing of casual corruption while professing to preserve the Bennett heritage. In relation to real estate, Richard made the move with ease. Let's make a final choice on this property. He pointed to the home in all directions. All stockholders would profit from the anticipated profits from the conversion to luxury condominiums, and the developers have made a very strong offer. In an effort to save Grandma's house one final time, I held out my hand. I want to suggest an option before we cast our votes. Beyond its potential as a home, this property has historical significance. What if we turned it into the headquarters of the Bennett Family Foundation? Grandma's legacy of community investment might be honored while the architecture is preserved. It was evident from Richard's face that he had already rejected the notion before I had even finished. Even if it's a novel idea, development would yield a larger financial return. When it comes to these resources, we must be realistic. Catherine then gave a nod. In addition, a foundation would need a lot of continuous supervision. While some of us may have the time for such endeavors, those of us actively boosting the family money have other responsibilities, she said, with a meaningful glance at me. With Richard holding close to 40% of the vote, and his friends another 45%, the subsequent vote was a formality. Jessica's 5% and my 2% didn't matter. There was strong support for the plan to sell Grandma's cherished house and build opulent condominiums in its stead. I experienced an odd sense of serenity as Richard laid out the schedule for leaving the property and starting the demolition process. This was no longer merely a housing issue. It was about our family's soul and the principles that had been compromised in the name of prestige and conspicuous consumption. I made a private phone call to Mr. Winters later that night. By a vote, they decided to sell the mansion. Gazing out at the garden, where my grandmother had taught me about genuine worth and patient investing, I informed him. Additionally, they want to utilize familial ties to coerce Victoria's building's unidentified owner into selling. Mr. Winters gave a quiet laugh. They don't know who they're up against, do they? Do you still intend to make your identity public tomorrow? Grandma's flowers were painted in crimson and gold hues by the sunset, which I witnessed. Yes, but first I need your assistance with something else. Are you able to prepare documents transferring Bennett Capital Holdings ownership to a new organization? One that would enable me to buy this property before developers can buy it. He remained silent for a moment before answering. Elizabeth used to say that you were the only one who really knew what legacy meant. In the morning, I'll have everything prepared. What would you like the new entity to be called? I grinned as I recalled my grandmother's favorite saying, wealth is a tool, not a trophy. Call it the legacy of Elizabeth. Have faith. I spent hours going over all of my holdings documentation after the call ended, getting ready for the bombshell that would permanently alter my relationship with my family. The rage and hurt I had experienced before had solidified into something stronger. Complete clarity on my identity and values. It didn't matter if they accepted me or not. They would finally realize tomorrow what it meant to be a Bennett in the ways that really mattered. I laid out all of my portfolio documents on the bed that night, alone myself in my childhood bedroom, carefully arranging them for tomorrow's disclosure. Even I found the full picture to be remarkable. Financial statements, investment accounts, corporation ownership structures, and property titles all demonstrate a net wealth that would astound my status-obsessed family. 15 properties in all, including 12 residential properties in desirable locations, 3 commercial buildings in quickly growing districts, and of course the opulent apartment complex where numerous family members resided. I have more than $73 million in total assets than Brad Blake and Victoria all together. I put everything in a leather portfolio that I had bought especially for this occasion, like the pricey ones my cousins brought to family gatherings. I was aware that this was the first time I had ever spent money on look rather than content, which was ironic. But the goal for tomorrow was to make an irrefutable statement. As I worked flashbacks of Grandma teaching me her patient wealth building philosophy while we were seated in this very room came flooding back. The issue with flaunting your wealth, Eliza, is that you're constantly spending rather than developing, she remarked. Showing off status is not the definition of true prosperity. The goal is to create opportunity and security. I recalled how she had trained me to look at neighborhood development trends and find properties with potential for long-term gain, as opposed to those with instant prestige value. My cousins, meanwhile, were purchasing opulent condominiums in established communities. I had heeded my grandmother's counsel to seek for underutilized regions that were about to undergo redevelopment. A modest duplex in an area that other investors had written off as transitional had been my first acquisition. As property values increased consistently, I had rented out one apartment and lived in the other, utilizing the revenue to pay down my mortgage. I sold it 2 years later for almost twice as much as I had originally invested, and I used the proceeds to buy 2 more houses. I kept up the simple lifestyle as my portfolio grew. My biggest risk had been the apartment complex, putting almost all of my liquid assets into one property. However, my study revealed high appreciation potential with quite minimal renovations, and the location was unmatched. I had implemented enhancements that raised value and tenant happiness, while remaining completely anonymous as the owner using the LLC structures Mr. Winters had helped create. I took out the original handwritten investment notebook that my grandmother had given me on my 18th birthday, in spite of what my whiny cousins might think. In my adolescent handwriting, the first item described the $500 I had placed in a mutual fund that she had suggested. My experience was detailed on page after page, starting with modest stock purchases and progressing to more complex investing choices. I will adhere to her research and patient beliefs, prioritizing value above flash. I ran my finger over her marginal annotations. Eliza, great study. Take into account the 10-year potential rather than the 2-year return. When she wasn't around to give me direct advice, these letters had helped me. A message from Mr. Winters rang on my phone. Every paper was prepared as asked. A legacy trust was formed for Elizabeth. All set to go tomorrow, at your signal. After sending a thank you text, I proceeded to arrange my portfolio, making sure that each document had the most possible effect. It was more than just showing off my wealth. It was about paying tribute to Grandma's genuine heritage of silent strength and careful management. I was startled by a gentle knock at my door at around midnight. With a worried look on her face, Jessica stood in the corridor. I wanted to make sure you were all right. During supper, you were silent. After a moment of hesitation, I moved aside to let her entry. I gathered the papers that were strewn all over my bed. She looked at the financial documents and property deeds, and her eyes grew wide. What's all this? Eliza. Jessica was the family member I trusted the most, but I had kept my secret for too long to casually share it. Right now. Just getting ready for tomorrow, I said incoherently. She produced a folder that I had overlooked, the one that had the records attesting to my ownership of the upscale apartment building where Victoria and Blake resided. As she read the title deed, her mouth fell open. You are the enigmatic proprietor. They have been griping about it. I gave a nod. I felt a wave of relief at finally telling someone who might be able to relate to my secret. Don't tell them yet, please. Tomorrow I intend to make everything public. Incredulous, Jessica fell onto the window seat and shook her head. They have been treating you like the suffering poor relative for all these years. What a covert millionaire you have become. I grinned at her surprise. I heeded my grandmother's counsel to live below my means and invest patiently. I was able to function more freely without family interference, the less they saw me. Jessica chuckled quietly. Brad will suffer a heart attack. Just tonight, he said someone need to teach you the fundamentals of real estate so that you can at least purchase a good automobile. Her face became grave. Are you certain you want to take this action? Everything will be different once they find out. They will either become your greatest pals out of the blue, or they will resent you. Neither choice is really desirable. Gazing out at the starry garden, I sat down beside her on the window seat. I must respect Grandma's heritage, even if I no longer need their approval. The true legacy. Uncle Richard has made a warped version of it. I described how I intended to use Elizabeth's legacy trust to buy the mansion, prior to Richard pitching it to developers. My hand was gripped by Jessica. She would be very pleased with you. Tomorrow I'll be by your side. I lay out my outfit for the last confrontation after she departed. I bought a basic yet well-fitting charcoal suit from a New York shop last year, but had put money aside for a unique event. Not ostentatious or designer branded, but subtly sophisticated, in a way that mirrored my true principles instead of the family's fixation with conspicuous status markers. The one item of family jewelry I had inherited, my grandmother's modest pearl necklace, was also my choice, since it perfectly embodied her belief in subtle beauty. I felt oddly at ease when I eventually got ready for bed. Everything will change tomorrow, but I was prepared. There was no longer the terrified, timid orphan who had tolerated their disdain. A lady who had constructed something solid took her position by upholding the genuine Bennett ideals of generating and utilizing prosperity with intention rather than flaunting it. I would face tomorrow's events with the knowledge that the person who had genuinely grasped the meaning of the Bennett legacy would be there in spirit. "Grandma, watch me tomorrow." To the moonlight chamber I murmured, "You'll be proud, I believe." With a crystal clarity that felt appropriate for the day of reckoning, Tuesday morning dawned. Wearing my fitted charcoal suit, I wore my mother's pearl studs and fashioned my grandmother's pearl necklace with thoughtful care. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman with substance and purpose, instead of the unworthy relative my family had long disregarded. I dabbed on some red lipstick for the first time, not to wow them, but as war paint for the fight to come. I got to the conference room 5 minutes early, set my leather portfolio down exactly where I always sit, and then went out into the corridor to get my bearings. The family had gathered in their customary arrangement when I got back at precisely 9 o'clock, with those of lower status arrayed in decreasing order of perceived significance. Uncle Richard is at the head of the table, surrounded by his inner circle of sycophants. Jessica glanced across at me and nodded subtly in support. Excellent. All of us are present. Without even acknowledging my presence, Richard started. "We'll talk about the apartment complex problem and finish the mansion selling arrangements today." He motioned for his helper to hand out folders that looked like developer contracts. "Construction is scheduled to start next month, and the Westbrook Development Group has made an offer of $48 million for the land. The preliminary agreements have been developed by their legal staff and are ready for all shareholders to sign today." As the table was surrounded with files, I stood still, listening to the family's eager muttering as they went over the huge dividends they would get under the existing stock arrangement. My 2% stake would bring in less than $1 million from the sale, while Uncle Richard would receive close to $18 million. "It's still a lot of money, but it's a small portion of what the others would get now," Richard added in reference to the apartment complex issue. "Jenkins has discovered a few possible sources of leverage with the enigmatic owner. In the event that they are unable to negotiate a fair offer, we have written a letter from the family attorney indicating that certain code compliance reviews may be imminent." I was furious at the casualness with which he portrayed what amounted to legal harassment, but I kept my cool. Before proceeding with either of these matters, I spoke with more confidence and strength than I had ever displayed at a family gathering. "I want to ask for permission to give a little presentation of my own." Impatiently, Richard looked at his watch. "Eliza, we have a busy day ahead of us. By midday, the developers want to have our signed contracts. It will not take long." Without waiting for his approval, I stood up and walked to the front of the room in response. Several cousins exchanged startled looks at my unusually forceful movement. I opened my portfolio and took out the most recent valuation of everything I owned. I've been listening to presumptions about my financial status for years. I started looking at each member of the family in turn. I've listened to the rumors of the poor relatives and experienced the sympathy, the condescension, and even the downright derision. Brad moved uneasily in his chair as Victoria's attention abruptly turned to her manicure. "Uncle Richard gave us a graph yesterday that illustrated how much each member of the family contributed to our overall fortune. I believe that data has to be updated." My $73 million net worth was displayed on the screen as I gave Richard's assistant the value report and told her to show it on the projector. The room went silent in shock. "This isn't possible." At last, Brad stammered, his cheeks becoming crimson. "There must be an error." I grinned stoically. "No error. I've been accumulating a real estate portfolio that has outperformed the majority of yours combined, while you've been purchasing sports vehicles and vacation houses." I started handing out copies of my full financial statement, relishing the astonished looks as relatives turned the pages that described my vast possessions. "However you reside in that little flat," Catherine made a feeble protest, "you choose to drive that ancient Toyota." "Not necessity," I said. "Grandma taught me that accumulating riches and flaunting it are sometimes mutually exclusive objectives." I decided to concentrate on the latter. Uncle Richard had become a curious shade of gray while he studied my bank records. How did you handle this without our network or family ties?" I nearly burst out laughing at the sincere confusion in his voice. I applied the patient investment and growth potential identification techniques that my grandmother taught me. These same values appear to have been abandoned by this dynasty in favor of ostentatious improvements and acquisitions motivated by prestige. I took another paper out of my portfolio, this one proving that I owned the upscale apartment building. In addition, you intended to intimidate and annoy the enigmatic owner. I kept moving around so that I could put the document right in front of Victoria. "You're all my renters, I think." Chaos ensued in the room. Blake tipped his glass of water over. Victoria looked at the document as though it would bite her, and Brad started to spew incoherently as he denied it. Uncle Richard's voice was harsher than I had ever heard it as he tried to recover control. "This isn't feasible. There is no way you could have gotten that building. It cost well over $20 million to buy." I grinned, taking pleasure in his misery. Actually, $28 million. Everything obtained by prudent investment development over a 10-year period in a lawful and moral manner. I turned to speak straight to my cousins. "You were grumbling about security enhancements I requested following the 12th floor break-in when you complained about construction noise at Breakfast Victoria. Additionally, Blake, the needless visitor registration requirement was implemented in response to 3 different instances of unapproved individuals using the pool and gym areas. In other situations, their shocked reactions would have been hilarious. Uncle Richard was going over my bank statements quite quickly. He scowled. "Even if all of above is accurate, the way the family votes on the sale of the mansion remains unchanged. The specified shareholding percentages served as the basis for preparing the agreements. I had been getting ready for this moment. I put one last piece of paper on the table, the documents pertaining to Elizabeth's legacy trust formation. In actuality, the ownership structure has just changed. At 9 this morning, I moved all of my assets to Elizabeth's legacy trust, which also bought Jenkins Development Company." I took a moment to consider the ramifications. As you may remember, Jenkins Development Company has gradually purchased 30% of Bennett family holdings through a number of proxy transactions over the years. Richard's face became absolutely white as he realized the full extent of what had transpired. "That isn't feasible," he said. "We would have been aware. Would you?" Quietly, I asked. The fact that no one had bothered to take note of what I was really doing for all these years further convinced you of my financial insignificance. Sputtering with my freshly consolidated voting shares, I turned to the whole family and spoke with a cool authority that even Brad was unable to match. "I currently own 35% of the Bennett family's assets. Not nearly a majority, but sufficient to prevent the sale of this mansion and any other significant decision." There was complete stillness after that. Richards, who is always calm, appeared to be at a loss for words. Jessica finally released the strain with a slow, grateful clap. "Bravo, cousin. It would make Grandma proud. Never one to give up easily." Brad pushed back from the table with elegance. "This is a trick of some sort. You can't simply go in and take over. After years of making no contributions to the family company." I stared at him steadily. "Brad, I haven't taken over. I've stopped those who have lost the true meaning of Grandma's heritage from destroying it." I collected my papers and went back to my chair, allowing them to take in the momentous change that had just taken place. I said bluntly, "The sale of the mansion is off the table. Regarding the apartment complex, don't worry. I don't want to kick out family members, but I will be examining the substantial rent reductions that some of you have been enjoying in comparison to other renters." Victoria's face red with shame or rage, or perhaps both. Ever the strategist, Uncle Richard was already adjusting. His face changed from one of astonishment to one of calculated evaluation of how to adjust to this new situation. He said maybe we might talk about a more cooperative approach to family holdings in the future. His voice was noticeably more polite than it had been only a few minutes before. "That's smart, in my opinion." I concurred, beginning with a review of Grandma's initial plan for the family legacy, which was centered on stewardship rather than prestige, and on carefully building money rather than flaunting it. I glanced around at their astonished expressions. That they were finally seeing me, really seeing me for the first time after all these years, gave me a peaceful sense of contentment, rather than a sense of victory. The Bennett family dynamics saw a dramatic change in the days after my disclosure that no one could have foreseen. Chaos and frantic recalibration characterized the immediate aftermath in the conference room. Uncle Richard is trying to maintain his power. Victoria unexpectedly found a profound admiration for my commercial skills that had seemingly been hidden from her for decades, while Brad alternated between incredulity and awkward attempts to recast our relationship. The metamorphosis was apparent and interesting. I was invited to a private lunch by Richard, who was the first to adapt. The following day, at his elite club, where he had never previously proposed that I accompany him, "It's obvious that I underestimated you." Looking at me across the white tablecloth with fresh eyes, he confessed, "Maybe conventional expectations of success have misled us all." I took a drink of my water, neither taking his olive branch nor turning it down. "We've confused the substance of wealth with its symbols," Grandma would say. He gave a contemplative nod. "Compared to the majority of the relatives I currently see, Elizabeth has always had a distinct viewpoint. You got that from her." His effort at reconciliation was expected, but it had conditions attached. He made suggestions about cooperating and using our combined power, which showed that he still didn't understand the core difference in our principles. I explained that any future cooperation would have to be in line with the values of responsible stewardship that Grandma had promoted. But I listened courteously without making any promises. A different strategy was used by Aunt Catherine, who unexpectedly showed interest in my charitable idea and invited me to tea at her country club. The tight corners of her grin revealed the strain of pretending she hadn't spent years patronizing me after rejecting my philanthropic donations as unimportant. "You know how essential family is." She recommended stroking my hand in a parental gesture that, if it weren't so calculated, would have been touching, despite our little disagreements over the years. Brad was obviously embarrassed to learn that his ostensibly suffering relative was far richer than he was, and he waited longer to approach me. He eventually contacted with a business proposition for a development project that he said required my special insight. It was open and honest, but his main goal was to have access to my money. If he wanted to talk about potential partnerships, I suggested that he review some of Grandma's financial concepts. I rejected gently but firmly. Not all of the responses were self-serving. In the ensuing family reorganization, Jessica, who had supported me during the disclosure, remained a staunch supporter. A week after the altercation, she quipped over coffee that it was like watching a nature documentary. We all giggled as we watched the Bennett family members adjust to the new apex predator in their natural environment. The sincere affection of our relationship, which contrasted sharply with the unexpectedly solicitous care from family members who had previously shunned me. I deliberately chose which connections to cultivate and which to keep at a respectful distance. Second chances were granted to those who demonstrated sincere regret for their prior treatment. Professional civility, but nothing more, was given to those who just changed their conduct without doing any meaningful reflection. My first significant endeavor was the future of Grandma's mansion, rather than Richard's intended sale to developers. I made it the home of the recently created Elizabeth Bennett Foundation, which is committed to financial literacy and affordable housing programs for marginalized areas. I couldn't help but notice the irony that the same relatives who had made fun of my alleged lack of money would now go to foundation functions in a structure that was maintained by the wealth they were unaware I had. I kept my small apartment and my trustworthy Toyota because I wanted to, not because I had to. The freedom to live without being constrained by the expectations of others had grown too important to give up. My cousins still occasionally voiced confusion at my preference for substance over appearance, but they no longer ventured to assume that it was a sign of incapacity now that they were aware of my financial realities. 6 months later, during a foundation function held at the estate, Martha, our family's long-standing housekeeper, approached me, marking the most significant outcome of my disclosure. "I sometimes dream about your grandmother," she revealed. Her grizzled hand was on mine. She was positively shining with pride last night. "Martha, she knew what the others had forgotten all along," she remarked. "That money should be used to secure good deeds, not to flaunt oneself." my eyes pinched with tears as Martha went on. "You were the one who really inherited the Bennett spirit. Miss Elizabeth would constantly say not the name or the wealth, but the essence of it. More than anything else, that confirmation meant that I was now respected by family members who had long disregarded me. My road to recovery wasn't quick. No moment of victory could undo the pain of decades of marginalization and disdain. Old habits were still threatening to resurface during family get-togethers. There were still times when a thoughtless remark from Victoria or Brad would cause old scars to flare up again. However, I became more at ease in my new position as a custodian of Grandma's actual legacy with every month that went by, striking a balance between upholding sound limits and forgiving others. The most important lesson I took away from my trip has nothing to do with money. Authenticity was the key. I had let my family misinterpret me for years, in part as a tactic, and in part because I still wanted their acceptance. Whether they liked what they saw or not, the freedom that comes with being seen in its whole was worth more than any property in my portfolio. I learned that achievement without moral character is meaningless, that familial ties without true respect aren't worth keeping, and that riches without a purpose becomes a burden. I experience a feeling of serenity today that goes beyond the validation of that momentous discovery day as I sit in my grandmother's rose garden, which has been protected in perpetuity by the foundation. Some of the Bennett family's connections are still developing and becoming more genuine. Other people keeping a polite distance. Young people from my mother's and from similar circumstances can now participate in financial literacy classes at the mansion that was almost sold for condos. Despite marrying into a wealthy family, the kindergarten teacher never lost sight of the importance of hard work and moral integrity. Uncle Richard still shows up in his Bentley for foundation meetings, and I still drive my Toyota there. But now that we both realize it's my decision rather than my restriction, things are different. My real estate holdings aren't the only source of my actual riches. It lies in the freedom to live a genuine life, regardless of what other people think, and to uphold principles that are more important than appearance and prestige. Additionally, privilege should be used for good rather than for selfish gain. How about you? Have you ever had friends or relatives undervalue you just to subsequently prove them wrong? Or perhaps you're still in the early stages of development when others aren't yet aware of your potential. Please share your tales in the comments section below. In order to hear more tales about finding strength and authenticity, even when others don't perceive your value, please press the like button and subscribe if this path of quiet tenacity and eventual vindication spoke to you. I appreciate you being here with me today. And keep in mind that waiting for the ideal opportunity to showcase your advantages can often be a more effective strategy than actually doing so.